For 24 hours, nobody knew where he was. The official Vatican schedule simply stopped. No morning audience, no public mass, no press briefing, no statement explaining the absence. The kind of absence that in any other institution would generate speculation, but in the Vatican generates something quieter and more unsettling. The particular silence of an organization that knows something and has decided, collectively and without coordination, not to say it. When he reappeared, the people who saw him first said the same thing, independently in different conversations. They said he looked like a man who had been handed a weight and had decided, without apparent hesitation, to carry it. Not burdened, not diminished. Something closer to the expression a person wears when they have finally stopped arguing with themselves about what they already know they have to do. What happened in those 24 hours is the story we are about to tell you. By the end of it, you will understand why the Vatican has been so carefully, so deliberately silent about it ever since. And you will understand why that silence, no matter how carefully maintained, is no longer going to hold. Pope Leo XIV went to Fatima in the middle of the night, without announcing it, and what he said the morning after may be the most consequential statement any pope has made on this subject in our lifetimes. This is not rumor. This is not speculation assembled from fragments. This is what happened, sourced carefully, told honestly, including the parts that are still incomplete. Because the incomplete parts matter too, and pretending otherwise would be doing exactly what this story is about someone refusing to do. To understand why a pope would board a plane in secret and travel through the night to a shrine in central Portugal, you need to understand something about the first year of Leo XIV's papacy. Not the public year, the headlines and the homilies and the carefully observed gestures that the Vatican's communications apparatus packaged for the world. The interior year. The year of a man who was elected on May 8th of 2025, in the particular grief and urgency that follows the loss of a beloved predecessor, and who has spent every month since moving with a quiet, systematic deliberateness that those closest to him describe as architectural. He is not improvising. He is building something. And the trip to Fatima was not an impulse. It was a conclusion. The sequence that led to it began several months ago with a document. Not the kind of document that arrives with ceremony and formal routing. The kind that arrives on a desk having traveled an unusual path, accompanied by a file that had not been opened in more than 30 years. The source was the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The material was related to Fatima. And according to two accounts that have since been corroborated by a third, what was in that file was not entirely what the world believes was released in the year 2000. Let's establish the baseline, because the story only makes sense if you understand the official history and where it leaves a gap. The third secret of Fatima was formally made public in June of 2000 under Pope John Paul II. Cardinal Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, provided a detailed theological commentary explaining what the vision described: a figure in white, a long climb, soldiers, the fall. The Vatican's interpretation held that this referred to the 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II. The Church declared the matter settled. The secret had been revealed. The public could examine it. Whatever had been mysterious about Fatima's withheld third secret was now, according to the institutional record, no longer withheld. Except, there has been a persistent thread, maintained quietly over the intervening decades by theologians, Vatican historians, and a small number of people with direct archival knowledge, suggesting that what was released in 2000 was the symbolic vision, the image, but not its accompanying verbal content. That alongside the visual sequence recorded by the children of Fatima, there existed a separate written statement, words attributed to the apparition itself, that was documented, archived, read by successive popes, and never made public. For years this remained in the category of informed speculation, the kind of thing discussed in academic journals and whispered at conferences but never confirmed by anyone in a position to know with certainty. Until a communication reached Leo XIV, apparently bypassing the usual filtering layers, and he read it. And then, some weeks later, he requested a private briefing on the full contents of the archival file. What happened next required extraordinary discretion from a small number of people, which is why the details have emerged slowly, reluctantly, from those who were present. On the evening of May 10th, an aircraft carrying the Pope, his personal secretary, a cardinal whose identity has not been publicly confirmed, and 2 members of the Swiss Guard landed in Lisbon. The Vatican's travel office logged the journey as a private pastoral visit. There was no press notification, no advanced security sweep beyond the minimum protocols. The delegation traveled from the airport to Fatima by road, arriving after the sanctuary had closed to the public for the night. They went directly to the chapel of the apparitions. Waiting there were 3 individuals. Their presence together in that space, at that hour, represents a convergence that those familiar with Fatima's institutional history describe as extraordinary. The first was a retired Portuguese bishop in his mid-80s, who had served in a sensitive archival capacity under 2 successive popes, and who possessed direct personal knowledge of the documentation decisions made during that period. The second was a theologian, a woman, who has spent her academic career studying the history and theology of Marian apparitions, and whose published work on Fatima's documentary history has been cited and pointedly ignored by Vatican officials for years. The third was a member of the original commission established in the 1990s to review the Fatima materials in preparation for the 2000 release. A man who was in the room, literally in the room, when the decision was made about what would be disclosed and what would not. These 3 people had been seeking an audience with the new pope since the earliest weeks of his pontificate. Their requests had been handled, or more precisely managed, by staff who had treated them with the polite dispatch reserved for persistent petitioners. Then, one of their communications reached the Pope's own hands. He read it, and he booked a plane. The meeting inside the Chapel of the Apparitions lasted 4 hours. For context, formal papal audiences last minutes. Extended working meetings with heads of state rarely exceed 90 minutes. 4 hours in the middle of the night, in a closed shrine, with 3 people whose combined archival and theological knowledge of Fatima's most sensitive materials spans more than 6 decades, represents an investment of time and attention that signals with absolute clarity that what was being discussed was not pastoral or ceremonial. It was substantive, it was specific, and it was, by all available accounts, conclusive. We do not have a transcript. That honesty matters. What we have are the accounts of what preceded the meeting, the observable condition of those present afterward, and most importantly, what the Pope said publicly the following morning. Because unlike the meeting itself, the morning Mass at the Fatima Shrine was recorded. Leo XIV celebrated Mass on the morning of May 11th. The Mass had not been announced publicly. The crowd was several hundred pilgrims who happened to be at the shrine that day, plus the local clergy who had been quietly notified overnight, plus the sanctuary staff. The shrine has permanent media infrastructure. There were cameras. The homily he delivered, 14 minutes, unscripted, delivered without notes, has since been described by Vatican analysts, theologians, and religious journalists as the most consequential papal statement on the subject of Fatima in at least a generation. Not because of its rhetoric. He was not theatrical. He was never theatrical. But because of its content, and because of the unmistakable quality of a person who has recently undergone a decisive interior movement and is now speaking from the other side of it. The architecture of what he said was this: the Church's relationship to truth is not a custodial one. What has been entrusted to the institution in matters of faith was not entrusted for safekeeping in the archival sense. It was entrusted for transmission. The mercy communicated through divine encounter is not served by the caution of institutional management. And certain forms of caution, whatever their original justification, have a point at which they cease to be prudent and become something that stands in direct opposition to the purpose they were designed to protect. Then he said the thing that made the people in that chapel go completely still. He said, "I have read what I was not expected to read. I have been told what was not intended to reach me. And I am no longer willing to act as though the weight of this knowledge belongs only to this office, and not to the people this office exists to serve." The silence that followed was, by all accounts, absolute. A sitting pope, standing at the most significant Marian apparition site in the modern Catholic world, telling those present, and the cameras transmitting to whatever audience would eventually see this, that he has accessed restricted information, and has made a decision about what to do with it. That is not a pastoral observation. That is not a homiletic flourish. That is a public commitment spoken in a place chosen with full awareness of its symbolic weight. The response from Rome arrived before most of the world had even seen the clip. The Secretariat of State released what it called a contextual clarification. This document is worth examining closely, because what it does not say is as significant as what it does. It does not characterize the Pope's words as having been taken out of context. It does not describe them as a misquotation or a misinterpretation. It does not distance the Vatican from the content of the homily. It says, in careful diplomatic syntax, that the Holy Father's words at the shrine reflect his personal pastoral engagement with the living tradition of Marian spirituality, and should be understood in that spirit. People who have spent careers parsing this kind of institutional language understood immediately. That sentence was not an explanation, it was a placeholder. It was the specific formulation an institution uses when it cannot deny what was said, and has not yet determined how to respond to it. It said nothing because nothing that it could actually say was available to it. That response was more revealing than a denial would have been. Now to the question of what Leo XIV actually encountered in that archival file, and what he apparently heard over those 4 hours in the chapel. The accounts we have been able to gather are incomplete, and we will not pretend otherwise. But what they suggest, taken together, is a picture with two distinct components. The first is what the persistent thread of informed speculation had long maintained, a written verbal element of the Fatima communication, distinct from the symbolic vision, that was recorded by the children and archived separately, and has remained in restricted access through multiple pontificates. Not a second vision. Words. A message in the direct declarative form that written prophecy takes when it is not being translated through imagery. The second component is more immediately institutional and in some ways more arresting. What appears to have been preserved in that file alongside the text itself is a record of the decision-making process around the choice not to release it. Not just the decision, the reasoning, the debates, the specific concerns that led successive popes and their closest advisors to conclude that full disclosure was inadvisable. And here is the detail that those who were present at the meeting describe as having affected the conversation most profoundly. The concerns recorded in that decision-making file were not primarily theological, they were institutional. They were about the relationship between the Catholic Church, as an organization with global reach and carefully maintained internal coherence, and the kind of direct prophetic communication that resists management by design. This requires some care in the telling, because it is easy to characterize it as cynical. It was not cynical, or not simply cynical. The people who made those decisions were operating from a genuine considered belief that the institutional stability of the Church was itself a pastoral good, that 1 billion Catholics were better served by an institution capable of absorbing and contextualizing difficult truths gradually than by the kind of raw prophetic disclosure that historical precedent, inside and outside Catholicism, suggests can produce fracture. But there is a fundamental problem with that argument, and it is the problem that Leo XIV apparently articulated during those 4 hours in the chapel at Fatima. The calculation only holds in an information environment where the institution can actually manage access. That environment is gone. The conditions that made the cost-benefit analysis of prophetic stewardship work for previous generations of Vatican decision-makers have dissolved. What gets archived today surfaces tomorrow. What is withheld in official documents circulates in fragments within months. The managed silence designed to prevent destabilization now produces more destabilization, not less, precisely because the managed silence is visible. People see it. They feel it. They fill it with versions that are sometimes more destabilizing than the original would have been. The man who had been present for the original suppression decisions reportedly wept during the conversation. He had, by his own account delivered over those 4 hours, been carrying the weight of that choice for decades. The arrival of a pope willing to hear not just what was decided but why it was decided, and to engage with the reasoning honestly rather than simply inheriting the outcome, appears to have broken something open in him that had been sealed for a long time. What does Leo XIV intend to do? The working understanding among Vatican analysts following this story is that he is preparing for a form of disclosure that has no precise precedent in the modern papacy. Not a formal Vatican document, not a staged press event with theological preface, not the kind of contextualizing apparatus that effectively interprets a text before the public has had a chance to encounter it directly. Something more immediate, more direct. Something that, in its form as much as its content, embodies the principle he stated at Fatima, that what was entrusted to the institution was always meant to reach the people the institution serves. The signals pointing in this direction are not subtle. The homily at Fatima was not subtle, and the Secretariat of State's inability to issue a substantive response was not subtle. What you are watching is an institution in the specific kind of suspension that precedes a significant shift. Not broken, not in crisis, but unmistakably waiting for something to land. To understand why this particular pope would be the one to do this, and not simply inherit the institutional position he received and maintain it as his predecessors did, you have to understand something about who Robert Francis Prevost actually is. He was born in Chicago in 1955. He entered the Augustinians as a young man and spent years in Peru, doing the kind of pastoral work that exists entirely outside institutional infrastructure. Communities where the church was not an organization with buildings and budgets and communications offices. Communities where faith was a living practice maintained by ordinary people, because no one else was going to maintain it for them. He became fluent not just in Spanish, but in the specific quality of conviction that survives in the absence of institutional support, because it was never dependent on it. He returned to Rome. He rose through the administrative structure. He became the prefect of the dicastery for bishops, one of the most consequential institutional positions in the Vatican, responsible for the selection and oversight of bishops worldwide. He was by any measure an insider, someone who understood the mechanics of the institution with the clarity that only comes from having worked inside them. But he never lost the other thing, the quality that everyone who worked closely with him across those years describes with similar vocabulary: a radical impatience with the managed version of anything, an apparent constitutional inability to accept that institutional comfort is a legitimate reason for an institutional church to withhold what it was constituted to transmit. When the College of Cardinals elected him on May 8, 2025, many of them believed they were choosing a man who would steady the institution, consolidate recent reforms without extending them, provide the kind of reliable continuity that large organizations need after periods of intensive change. They had read his administrative record correctly. They had perhaps underestimated something about his formation. The first year of his papacy has been a sequence of moves, each individually defensible within the scope of normal papal authority, each cumulatively pointing in a direction that some inside the institution have found clarifying and others have found alarming. The restructuring of the communications office, the document on synodality that extended significantly beyond its predecessors, the quiet but clearly intentional engagement with Orthodox leadership on terms more substantive than anything in recent memory. And now this. A pope who traveled in secret to a shrine in central Portugal and stood at its altar the following morning and said, in front of cameras and pilgrims and the permanent media infrastructure of one of Catholicism's most charged sacred sites, that he has encountered information the institution did not expect him to encounter, and that he is no longer willing to treat it as solely his own burden. The reaction within the global church has divided along familiar lines, but with unusual clarity. Those who have long believed that the full Fatima disclosure was incomplete, who watched the 2000 release with the specific dissatisfaction of people who recognize a managed narrative when they encounter one, found in the Fatima homily something they had stopped expecting: vindication. The experience of hearing a pope say, essentially, "You were right to believe there was more." Those inside the institutional structures, the curial conservatives, the national bishops' conferences with long investment in the stability of existing frameworks, found something different. Not a scandal, exactly, but a threshold. A point at which the direction of travel this pontificate represents stopped being a concern about pace and became a concern about destination. Several European bishops' conferences have reportedly requested emergency briefings from the Secretariat of State. The Brazilian Bishops' Conference, representing the largest Catholic community in the world, issued a statement notably warm toward the Fatima remarks. The American response, predictably, has been shaped by the same fractures that shape everything in American Catholic life, with traditionalist outlets characterizing the episode as reckless and progressive Catholic media characterizing it as overdue. None of these responses changes the underlying situation, which is this. A pope made a public commitment, in a charged setting, before cameras, to an audience of pilgrims and the world. He said he is no longer willing to treat this information as belonging only to him. That commitment does not dissolve because the Secretariat of State issues a contextual clarification. It is in the record. It was witnessed. And on the question of witnesses, there is a detail from the aftermath of the meeting at Fatima that has stayed with everyone who heard it. One of the 3 individuals who met with Leo XIV that night said something to a journalist afterward. The account is second-hand, sourced through someone we trust, and we believe it is accurate. What this person said, in describing the quality of the 4-hour conversation, was this. He did not come to us to be persuaded. He had already arrived at his position before the meeting began. He came to us because he wanted witnesses. He wanted the weight of what he was deciding to exist in more than one person's memory. A pope who traveled through the night to the site of one of the most significant prophetic events in modern Catholic history, and arrived not with questions but with a decision already formed, wanting only the particular gravity that comes from having witnesses, is a pope who understands something important about the relationship between institutional authority and human accountability. The decision had to be seen by people who could carry it. That is not weakness. That is a specific kind of moral seriousness. The church Leo XIV is shepherding is the church that built the archives those materials have been stored in for decades. It is also the church of the 3 children who stood in a field in Portugal in 1917 and received a message and carried it with the particular faith of people who had not been asked whether they were ready. They were 10 years old and 8 and 7. They had no institutional authority. They had no theological credentials. They had only the experience of having been present for something that changed them completely, and the faith that if they had been given it to carry, there was a reason. Robert Francis Prevost became Pope Leo XIV 1 year ago. He has spent that year quietly learning what he was given to carry, and also what he was given to release. The trip to Fatima was not the beginning of that discernment. It was the conclusion. What comes next will unfold over the coming weeks, and possibly months, and we will be here for every step of it. When the Vatican issues its next statement, we will examine it word by word, because in this story the space between the words is as important as the words. When additional accounts emerge from the people who were in that chapel, we will bring them to you with the same care for accuracy we've maintained throughout. And if Leo XIV does what the evidence suggests he is preparing to do, if he releases what has been sealed, if he stands somewhere before the church and the world and says what the children of Fatima were always asking the church to say, that this was always meant for you, that it was never meant to be kept, then you will want to have understood the road that led here. The meeting happened. He came back changed. And a church that has spent a century learning how to manage this particular weight is about to discover whether the man it elected has decided that managing it is no longer the right way to honor what it contains. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Share this with anyone who has been following this story. The next development is coming, and you are going to want to understand it when it arrives.